Yeah, so you're being really nice. You're saying I sound nuts. How are icebergs going to solve the water crisis? Right, and again, I think it's part of the story that we receive about icebergs. Is that there are these either really dangerous objects, which they are undoubtedly, or these mythical, mystical, rarefied gems, that are so special we should just look at them. Um, in reality, icebergs contain a tremendous amount of freshwater. So two-thirds of freshwater on planet Earth is locked away in the poles and ice caps and glaciers. And all we need is a few icebergs to really make a dent into this problem.
What's up, everybody, from Nautilus? I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Matthew Birkhold. Matthew is a professor at The Ohio State University, focusing on law, environmental humanities, intellectual property, and indigenous studies. He is the author most recently of Chasing Icebergs, How Frozen Freshwater Can Save the Planet. And his writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, The Paris Review, and others. His recent story in Nautilus, an excerpt from his new book, was the Iceberg Cowboys, who wrangle the purest water on Earth. Matthew, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. It's nice to be here.
All right. To start off, would you mind summarizing your intellectual and academic background, as well as some of your work as a writer?
Yeah, so I'll start all the way back. I grew up in Minnesota, which means that I like cold places, and I was excited to have a career that took me to more cold places. So I got my BA from Columbia University, started law school at Columbia, had a crisis, so got a PhD, got a little sick of that, then finished up law school, and then worked for the US State Department for a year as a legal advisor, doing international law, and then quit that job because I didn't like having a boss and I wanted to write books.
Right on. That was very succinct. So what was your first book? There was a book before Chasing Icebergs that had to do with some literary history, I believe.
Yeah, that's right. So on the surface, it's pretty unrelated. It's about fan fiction. So authors who take characters invented by another author and weave them into their own stories. So my first book looks at fan fiction in the 18th century. Before copyright law existed, how did people regulate this resource? How did people figure out who owned what? So I always attribute it to being an identical twin and sharing everything in my life. I think I'm really fixated on questions of ownership. So the first book is about who owns fictional characters, and now the second book is who owns icebergs.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay. So on the topic of your latest book, Icebergs, do you want to give us a brief summary of the excerpt we ran for viewers who may not have read it yet?
Yeah, so for part of this book, I'm looking at whether icebergs can be a solution to the water crisis that's worsening every year as climate change intensifies. And the book took me to Newfoundland to look at people who actually try to wrangle icebergs. I think for most of us who live far from the oceans and who don't live at the poles, icebergs feel like these looming giants that take down ships like the Titanic. So we've internalized this lesson: stay away from icebergs. But there are a handful of really brave people who go and try to collect icebergs and harvest them either to use or away from oil rigs. So I was lucky enough to fly to Canada and talk to some of the folks who are doing this arduous work.
And maybe you could also talk a little bit about what the appeal is of getting icebergs and, hauling them onto a boat and bringing them back. What are some of the things people want to use icebergs for?
Yeah, I was going to say, to be fair, it's not appealing. I don't want to do that work. And Ed Kane, if you read the excerpt in your magazine, I mean, this is really backbreaking work. This is dangerous work, and he has a hard time finding people to be in his crew. But iceberg water is extremely pristine. There's no minerality. The icebergs calve from glaciers that were formed hundreds of thousands of years ago, before there's any pollution on the planet. So it's about as pure water as you can get on planet Earth. So people are excited to use it either for drinking water or use it in other products like beers or wines, for fine cosmetics. There's a growing market for iceberg water for a variety of products.
That's really cool. And
let me ask you, have you ever had iceberg water?
No. I would love to try. I think I remember in your piece, you got to go to a bar and have some beer that was made with some of this very pure water?
Yeah, that's right. So there's an iceberg beer in Newfoundland. It's
That is so
good.
cool.
It's good. I'm no connoisseur, but it tastes special.
Yeah. So what are some of the other stories, or perhaps we could start with, you mentioned the water crisis. Can you give us a sketch of what that consists in? I mean, what should we be worried about here?
Yeah, it's always a depressing story to have to tell, but I think an important one, especially for those of us who are lucky enough to live in the United States in places with clean water supplies. So I'm talking to you from Columbus, Ohio, where there's an abundance of really good fresh water for us to use, but that's not the reality for most of the world. So if we project into the future a little bit, by 2030, the global demand for fresh water will exceed supply by 40%. So currently, 107 countries lack a sustainably managed water source, and 2/3 of the world's population in just 7 years are going to face regular water shortages. So there's this growing crisis, and it's easy for people like me to forget about it. So I always like the opportunity to remind people, we're extremely privileged here, and a lot of people are going to suffer and die because of a lack of fresh water.
So how can we better use the icebergs that are available and the glaciers to address this issue that is coming right for us?
Yeah, so you're being really nice. You're saying I sound nuts. How are icebergs going to solve the water crisis? Right, and again, I think it's part of the story that we receive about icebergs, is that there are these either really dangerous objects, which they are undoubtedly, or these mythical, mystical, rarefied gems, that are so special we should just look at them. In reality, icebergs contain a tremendous amount of freshwater. So 2/3 of freshwater on planet Earth is locked away in the poles and ice caps and glaciers. And all we need is a few icebergs to really make a dent into this problem. So an iceberg that's 2,000 feet long and 650 feet wide could supply all of Cape Town, South Africa with water for an entire year. So the question then is, how do we get that iceberg water to the people who need it?
And what is the answer to that question?
The answer, I think, is Ed Kane in Newfoundland. It's these funny guys who are harvesting icebergs off the coast of Canada there. I think they have a lot of the secrets for us because they figured out how to approach these dangerous objects and how to wrangle them into submission. So the way that the Canadian Ice Patrol thinks about icebergs as a migration of icebergs coming from the western coast of Greenland down Iceberg Alley along the Labrador coast there. So we just need these cowboys now to go out and capture them for us. So the way you do it depends on who you are. If you're Ed Kane in Newfoundland, you might shoot an iceberg with a gun to break off a piece of it. If you're an oil company, you're trying to wrap a big net around icebergs and then slowly nudge them into the right trajectory away from your oil rig.
Okay. Yeah, and what are some of the other stories that you tell and important bits of information that you want to convey in the rest of the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. And one of the reasons I want people to know about what's going on in Newfoundland is that often when iceberg towing makes it into the news, it's treated as a joke. So this isn't a new idea. It was popular in the 1970s. There was an international conference organized and the brightest minds got together. And the conclusion was, this is the stuff of science fiction. The good news is we're not stuck in the 1970s and the technology has developed that now we can actually do this. And if we look at what oil companies are doing and if we look at what private entrepreneurs are doing, we see that people have managed to find the technologies to actually get to the iceberg water. And we have the satellites now to locate icebergs in ideal locations. We have a better understanding of the oceans and climate change and ocean eddies. So people have now done modeling. Alan Condren at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, for instance, has modeled to show, look, you can get an iceberg all the way from Antarctica to South Africa or to the Middle East, and it's not going to melt. It's going to be big enough. We're going to have water when we arrive. So what my book is looking at, it's telling a string of stories to try to convince people this isn't a joke, and we need to stop taking it as a joke, but actually think seriously about the possibility of icebergs as a freshwater source.
And there is some urgency to this because once an iceberg does start to melt significantly, then that fresh water is just lost into the mix of salt water in the ocean, right? Um, so, and you talk a lot about in the excerpt, at least, how you can calculate or predict how much an iceberg might melt given its shape and how fast it's moving and so forth. You want to give us a little outline of that?
Yeah, so luckily, people much smarter than I have done these calculations, and they know the variables, thinking about melt rate, how waves affect icebergs depending on its shape, how the sun influences melting, how keeping salt water closer to an iceberg changes the melt rate. So there are a number of variables you have to take into consideration, including how big the iceberg is and how fast it's moving. So often when oil companies are towing icebergs, they're going at 1 mile per hour. Right, it's like actually unfathomably slow how you have to tow this through the ocean. But it's clear if you get a big enough iceberg, again 2,000 feet, assuming it's wrapped in some sort of protective material, you can tow it someplace without losing a lot of the water. A bigger challenge is what do you do once an iceberg is sitting in warmer water, because it's going to melt really quickly. So luckily we have companies developing new technologies to capture that water before, as you said, it's wasted and we just lose this fresh water to the salty oceans.
How did you get interested in this problem and this topic, and get to a point where you wanted to write a book about it?
Uh, that's a really good question. It was an accident, actually. I was on Newfoundland on vacation researching something else, and I was wet and cold after being in this remote corner of the world, and went to a bar, and I ordered a drink, and it was served with iceberg water. Icebergs contain trapped air, right? If you think about it, it's snow being compressed over time, so air particles get trapped. So as iceberg water or iceberg ice melts, it crackles. It's a little bit like Pop Rocks, if you can imagine the old candy. So in Newfoundland, they serve drinks with iceberg water for tourists like me as a novelty. So I asked my server, how did you get this iceberg? And he said, oh, I just hopped on my jet ski and scooped it up and brought it back to the bar and then just hacking it into pieces. And my mind exploded with questions about the legality of just going and harvesting this freshwater from the ocean. That in Newfoundland, depending on the size of the operation, it's a first come, first serve basis. So then as I started exploring this, I realized this is how it works for the world right now. First comes, first served on an iceberg in international water. And if we want to use icebergs to help combat the water crisis, this might not be the best system.
Why do you think that is?
If a large company interested in producing bottled water gets to an iceberg first, they're going to sell bottled water rather than give iceberg water away for free to a city like Cape Town that might be running out of water. So historically, when there is a race for resources, it ends up in hands of wealthy consumers, and there's significant environmental harm that results because companies are often more interested in pursuing profits than protecting the environment. So my book is a call for wake up, pay attention to icebergs, but please also do it responsibly, which might be a big ask because it's going to take some cultural shifts in how we think about icebergs in order to use them that way. So I don't think this is in the excerpt, but there's currently a high-end iceberg water that sells for $150 a bottle.
Wow.
Yeah, and this is where being a professor is great because obviously I needed to order a bottle for research. So we got our $150 bottle. Yeah, enjoyed it. And from my perspective, it was quite good. It was very different than the tap water I drink. Do I think we should be selling iceberg water for $150? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, that's a tough economic question.
Would you buy iceberg water for $150 a bottle?
It makes me think of research and sort of economic behavioral psychology, where if you price something high enough, your value and enjoyment of consuming that thing goes up because you put more of your resources into it. So perhaps the experience of it and the appreciation of it is greater if you're willing to pay more.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So this is how, fine consumer goods work.
Yeah.
And there's actually a fine water society that brands water sommeliers, just like wine sommeliers, who tell you how good a water is or not. It's about storytelling, right? So the story that's told about Iceberg are these are precious gems. You're tasting a pure bit of the Arctic when you pay $150 for water, and aren't you special for doing that? And I think for a lot of us who don't see icebergs regularly, they do feel really special and magical, the way they glisten in the water. Tourists flock to Canada to do this. But then that means icebergs are going to be left to the hands of the elite if we continue to think about icebergs as something precious.
Totally. Yeah. They have this otherworldly quality to them for, most of us who don't live by the poles, as you said. I think kind of the free ranging access to them kind of reminds me of the situation now with people wanting to mine asteroids. I think it's sort of the same policy, right? Where if you can get there and haul it in and start chipping away at it and getting the resources there, go for it. It's all yours.
Yeah. Except so I was born in '85. I practiced international law. I'm actually quite an institutionalist. I think the UN does good work, so I think we need the international community to come together to regulate this resource before people go after it. Um, and again, the only way we're going to manage to do that is if we stop thinking about this as a joke and we think about icebergs as belonging to everyone, not just wealthy elites.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about any more interesting tidbits from your travels or research, or anecdotes or ideas that for whatever reason you didn't end up putting it into the book, but it was part of your journey learning about this subject?
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in Greenland to write this book. And there's a funny relationship between Greenland and Canada because these icebergs come from Greenland and then they go to Canada. So there's a question of who ought to have that iceberg. Is it Greenland that took care of it and where it started, or is it the Canadians downstream who are relying on it coming? So there's a whole legal quagmire. But in my time in Greenland, when I first arrived, I thought icebergs were beautiful and stunning, and I spent so much time looking at them. And then I realized the Greenlanders around me see thousands and thousands of icebergs every day. And they still think they're beautiful, but it's a little bit like a dandelion. If you really stop and you look at a dandelion, it's great, but it would never occur to you to sell this thing or to do anything special with it. So learning from that perspective helped me think, okay, these aren't special. People dying of thirst, in Cape Town have absolutely a right to this and not just, elites in New York. And I also got to try to harvest icebergs myself in Greenland.
How did that go?
Not great. Not great. Turns out I'm not strong enough and I'm not brave enough to go after a big iceberg. My strategy is more what the Greenlanders I encountered do, which is wait for an iceberg to wash up on the beach, then roll up your pants and grab it yourself. So a lot of folks in Greenland have icebergs in their refrigerators, and when they have a big party, they just chip into the iceberg and you don't have to go to the store for ice.
That's so cool. What are you working on at the moment now that this book is done? What's your next article or book project?
Yeah, so I'm currently thinking about who owns Antarctica, which is also a frozen issue, if I can make a bad pun, in international law. We've agreed no one owns Antarctica, and there are a few regulations governing its use. One of the values we protect is aesthetics. We want to preserve what Antarctica looks like. So my next project is thinking about what does Antarctica look like and through whose eyes are we viewing this continent?
That's interesting.
The answer is, straight white guy's eyes. So what sort of limitations that places on aesthetic requirements is what I'm looking at now.
Yeah, so some of the epic storytelling about discovering Antarctica or exploring it was done by European explorers looking to chart new land, and yeah, that's the demographic of people who did that.
Yeah, doing research for chasing icebergs, I talked to a number of glaciologists and a number of incredible women who have done field work, in Greenland and in Antarctica. And Ellen Mosley Thompson was telling me when she first tried to go to Antarctica, no women were allowed, even on research teams. And one of the informal reasons given was, well, there aren't hairdressers in Antarctica. So what would you do? So the good news is we've come a long way as a society. I think that we still have a lot of ground to cover, though.
Totally. As a way to close, do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? Do you have a website they can visit or social media accounts they can follow
I
to
have
get your work?
I have a website. I would say you can find me on your magazine. Otherwise, I don't really participate in social media.
All right. Okay. Well, Matthew, it's been great talking to you. Thanks so much for giving us some good information on your book, and hopefully it'll encourage some people to check it out and worry more about this water crisis and what icebergs can do to help.
Worry less. We have a solution.
Okay. There you go.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks very much.
Of course.